The Indian Councils Act of 1909 is also known as the Morley Minto Reforms, because at that time Lord Morley was the Secretary of State for India and Lord Minto was the Viceroy of India. The reforms that they initiated were known as Morley Minto Reforms. Now, these reforms gave a very rosy picture. They seemed to be in favor of the Indians and for the benefit of the Indian people. But the real purpose was to confuse the moderate nationalists, divide the nationalist ranks, and check the growth of unity among Indians. Because the Indians, when stood united, posed a threat to the British rule in India. The British rule was under pressure from all sides, from Indians who were standing unitedly, Indians from all walks of life. Each section of the Indian society was taking part in the national movement, and this threatened the British rule. The Swadeshi movement was at its peak during the early years of 20th century. During Swadeshi movement, Indians were boycotting British goods. The use of Indian goods and boycott of British goods was proclaimed and pledged. Swadeshi laid emphasis on self-reliance or Atma Shakti. Self-reliance meant assertion of national dignity, honor, self-confidence. It meant fostering the indigenous industry. Many textile mills, soap or match factories, handloom weaving concerns, national banks, insurance companies were opened. Also, at many places, there was public burning of foreign cloth. And also shops selling foreign cloth were picketed. During the 20th century, there was a debate and disagreement going on between moderates and militant nationalists, of which the Britishers wanted to take advantage. So the militant nationalists wanted to extend the Swadeshi and boycott movement from Bengal to the rest of the country, and to extend the boycott to every form of association with colonial government. They wanted to boycott the association with colonial government. They wanted to boycott the British government itself. Whereas the moderates wanted to confine the boycott movement to Bengal only. And even in Bengal, they wanted it to limit the boycott of only foreign goods, not to association with British government. So the British government played the game of divide and rule, because over here the moderates and militant nationalists were not agreeing on one thing. So the Britishers wanted to take advantage of this disagreement. The British government played the game of divide and rule while suppressing the militant nationalists. It tried to win over the moderate nationalists so that the militant nationalists could be isolated and suppressed. And to placate the moderate nationalists को खुश करने के लिए, the Britishers announced constitutional concessions through the Indian Councils Act of 1909, which are also known as the Morley Minto Reforms. Lord Morley was the then Secretary of State for India and Lord Minto was the then Viceroy of India. The Morley Minto Reforms increased the number of elected members in both the central and provincial legislative councils. But most of the elected members were elected indirectly. It considerably increased the size of legislative councils, both central and provincial, and the number of members in the Central Legislative Council was raised from 16 to 60, and the number of members in the provincial legislative council was not uniform. It was different for different provinces, but it was increased in every province. So the elected members were increased, but the elected members were also not elected directly. They were elected indirectly. Also, the number of elected members in these councils was less than half of the total membership. So the elected members were not elected by people, but by landlords, organizations of traders and industrialists, universities and local bodies. That is, common people did not vote for these for the people to be elected. The elected members were elected by some influential people like landlords, industrialists, traders. The reformed councils still enjoyed no real power. These indirectly elected members also, they could merely give advice. They were not allowed to take any decisions. The reforms in no way changed the undemocratic and foreign character of British rule, or the fact of foreign economic exploitation of the country. Swadeshi movement was going on because India was being economically exploited. So this economic exploitation also did not stop, and neither did the undemocratic and foreign character of British rule change after these reforms, Morley Minto reforms. These reforms enlarged the deliberative functions of legislative councils at both the central and provincial level. What are deliberative functions? Example for a deliberative function is that members were allowed to ask supplementary questions, more resolutions on the budget, and so on. No real change was there. Also, for the first time, Morley Minto reforms provided for association of Indians with the executive council of the viceroy and governors. They introduced a system of communal representation for Muslims by accepting the concept of separate electorates. These reforms, Morley Minto reforms, they introduced the system of separate electorates, under which all Muslims were grouped in separate constituencies, from which Muslims alone could be elected. There were constituencies from which only the people who followed Muslim religion could be elected. So this was done in the name of protecting the Muslim minority. Under this, the Muslim members were to be elected only by Muslim voters. अगर दूसरे words में कहा जाए तो this act legalized communalism, and Lord Minto came to be known as the father of communal electorate. But in reality, this was a part of the policy of dividing Hindus and Muslims and thus maintaining British supremacy in India. This was a step taken, this was a process through which they ensured that Hindus and Muslims are not united, they remain divided, so that British rule could continue. This system proved extremely harmful. It checked the progress of India's unification, which had been a continuous historical process. Hindus and Muslims had been living together peacefully in India from so many centuries. And this was a step towards checking that unification. It became a potent factor for the growth of communalism, both Hindu and Muslim communalism in the country. Thus, the real purpose of Morley Minto reforms of 1909 was to confuse the moderate nationalists, who soon realized that the reforms had not really granted much, and they gradually lost the respect and support of public and were reduced to a small political group. In the starting of this lecture, I told you that moderates and militant nationalists were having debate and disagreement regarding how the Swadeshi movement should be carried on. So the Britishers suppressed the militant nationalists and tried to placate the moderates. But the moderates soon realized that they had उन्होंने ब्रिटिशर्स की बात थोड़ी मान ली, बट नाउ दे रियलाइज दैट द रिफॉर्म्स हैड नॉट रियली ग्रांटेड मच, और इस वजह से they lost the respect and support of public and were reduced to a small political group. So to divide the nationalist ranks and to check the growth of unity among Indians, these Morley Minto reforms, or the Indian Councils Act of 1909, was carried out. Morley Minto reforms provided for the first time for association of Indians with executive councils of viceroys and governors. Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first Indian to join the viceroy's executive council. He was appointed as the law member. Also provided for separate representation of presidency corporations, chambers of commerce, universities and zamindars.